Imagine, for just a minute, that you are a highly ambitious, freshly minted Western corporate executive.
Oh, like the ultimate go-getter type.
Exactly. And the year is, let's say, roughly 1992. You work for this massive European multinational, maybe it's Heineken or the Dutch dairy giant Campina.
Right, big players.
Huge. And the Iron Curtain has just been torn down. The Soviet Union is officially dissolved. So this vast, mysterious region that was closed off for literally generations has suddenly just flung its doors completely wide open.
It was basically viewed as the ultimate frontier market back then.
Totally. And you have just touched down at the airport in Moscow or St. Petersburg. You step off the plane wearing this pristine power suit. Your briefcase is practically overflowing with spreadsheets and, 5-year projections.
It's absolutely vibrating with energy, I bet.
Oh, vibrating. You are ready to bring the gospel of corporate capitalism, supply chain efficiency, and quarterly profit margins to the masses.
Because the optimism was blinding at that time. From London to Wall Street to Amsterdam, the consensus was just, it was that this was a gold rush.
A total gold rush.
A completely untapped consumer base of nearly 300 million people just waiting to be integrated into the global market.
Right, so you hit the ground running, you secure this premium office space, you start hiring a local staff, and you eagerly roll out the exact same corporate playbook that worked perfectly in Brussels or New York or Tokyo.
Copy and paste.
Exactly. You gather your new local team in a conference room and you start talking about optimizing those profit margins. You enthusiastically introduce the concept of corporate democracy.
I can just picture the blank stares already.
Seriously, you tell them, we want proactive feedback. We want to hear your voice in our monthly synergy meetings. You talk about personal initiative, climbing the corporate ladder, owning your individual career trajectory.
All the classic buzzwords.
All of them. You lay it all out and then you step back, just waiting for the magic of the free market to take hold. But instead of a room full of eager ladder-climbing upstarts ready to crush their KPIs, you are met with total chilling silence.
Just absolute bewilderment on both sides of that conference room table.
Your new employees seem, completely detached from the very idea of profit margins. The concept of corporate democracy just confuses them. And they show absolutely zero interest in fiercely competing against one another to climb some hypothetical ladder.
Which is so completely countered to what a Western executive would expect.
Right. To your Western eyes, they appear almost lethargic or deeply apathetic toward the very foundation of individual ambition. And you're just left standing there, sweating in your power suit, desperately wondering, what is going on here? Why aren't they behaving like us?
And that specific scenario, the profound, really jarring disconnect between Western economic expectations and Russian cultural reality, is honestly one of the most fascinating historical collisions of the 20th century.
It really is.
And the answer to that executive's question isn't found in a faulty translation or a bad management seminar. It's buried beneath a millennium of history.
Which is exactly what we're going to untangle today. We are pulling from this incredibly comprehensive lecture by Marie-Thérèse Haar. She's a historian and cultural expert who has spent over 40 years deeply intertwined with Russia, studying its history, untangling its culture, living among its people.
Yeah, and it is worth briefly framing the context of her work, especially right now.
Definitely.
Haar acknowledges right out of the gate that speaking about Russia today carries an immense amount of geopolitical baggage. She's been very open about receiving intense backlash, even hate mail, just for continuing to analyze the region.
Which is heavy, but her academic mission is hyper-focused. And we're going to report impartially on her worldview for this deep dive. She isn't looking at the day-to-day politics or the actions of the state. She's looking at the everyday people and the grand sweep of history.
Exactly. She argues, quite passionately actually, that everyday Russians hold a deep admiration for Europe and that beneath the modern headlines there's a profound shared cultural DNA with the West.
So we are stepping entirely out of the modern news cycle today to look at the invisible, thousand-year-old forces that built the psychology of a massive portion of the globe.
How two cultures that basically started from the exact same root ended up operating on completely different wavelengths.
Right. We're going to explore the surprising similarities that lured those 1990s corporate executives into a false sense of security, and then we are going back in time. We'll trace 3 massive, world-altering divergences that permanently split the West from the East.
And to really understand why that executive from Campina or Heineken was so spectacularly blindsided, we have to look at why they felt so confident in the first place.
Yeah, because they walked into that conference room thinking they were dealing with people who were fundamentally just like them.
And you can't entirely blame them. On the surface, the illusion of sameness is incredibly convincing.
It really is. If you just look at the broad strokes, the ties are undeniably deep. We're talking about physical proximity, shared physical traits among Eastern Slavs and Western Europeans, and an enormous shared religious bedrock.
Right, they are a deeply Christian nation. They celebrate the same Easter, the same Christmas, even if the dates slide around a bit on the calendar because of the Orthodox tradition.
The spiritual architecture just feels very familiar to a Westerner.
It does. And the historical intertwining of the ruling classes is even more explicit. For centuries, the royal houses of Europe and the Russian Empire didn't just communicate. They intermarried to the point of basically being one giant, complicated family tree.
Which is wild to think about.
Yeah, Haar highlights some incredible examples of this cross-pollination. Take the 19th century, for instance. Anna Pavlovna, a Russian Grand Duchess born into the House of Romanov, marries the Prince of Orange and literally becomes the Queen of the Netherlands.
I found the detail about the royal jewelry absolutely fascinating.
Oh, the brooches.
Yeah, if you watch state banquets today and look at the modern Dutch royals, Queen Maxima, for instance, some of the dazzling historical brooches and tiaras she wears actually contain gems that originated in the Romanov dynasty.
The literal wealth, the bloodlines, the high society customs, they were completely merged for centuries.
And that merger wasn't restricted to just the monarchs either. The intellectual and artistic parity was immense. We are talking about the foundational pillars of global high culture.
Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Tchaikovsky.
Exactly. Terhar emphasizes how deeply the Russian people cherish this high culture today, and that reality completely shatters the very flat, very gray stereotype that many in the West still cling to.
Oh, that gray stereotype is so heavily ingrained in us. When you ask someone in the West to picture Russian culture, their mind almost instantly defaults to the Cold War.
Totally. They picture brutalist architecture, state-mandated art, endless lines for bread, and, as Terhar so perfectly puts it, communist propaganda with red screens and tractors.
Right. We imagine this grim, joyless industrial existence. But the reality on the ground, both historically and right now, is vibrantly different.
Her descriptions of modern Russian cultural life are incredibly vivid. She talks about these massive modern Tchaikovsky festivals. And it's not some stuffy elite gathering in a closed concert hall.
No, it's outside.
Yeah, picture being out in the vast, ancient Russian forests on a gorgeous summer evening. The sky is dotted with hot air balloons. And down below, sitting on the grass, are thousands of young people, 18, 20 years old, who were steeped in this music during their schooling.
That sounds absolutely magical.
Doesn't it? They're out in the woods, hanging out with their friends, listening to world-class musicians perform classical masterpieces under the stars.
And it's not just classical music that thrives like that. She points out the modern film industry, particularly centered around St. Petersburg.
Right.
They're producing cinema that is highly sophisticated, incredibly humorous, and deeply spiritual. There are massive festivals dedicated to Andrei Tarkovsky, who is one of the most philosophical, introspective filmmakers in global cinema history.
This is a society that wrestles with the deepest questions of the human soul through art, totally in step with the greatest artistic traditions of Paris or Rome or London.
So put yourself back in the shoes of those Western executives in 1991. You have massive banks like ING and Rabobank, or consumer giants like Coca-Cola, surveying this newly opened landscape.
And they look around and what do they see?
They see a population that looks like them. They see a shared Christian heritage. They see grand European-style architecture in St. Petersburg. They see a people who read the same classic literature and listen to the same symphonies.
The aesthetic familiarity was a trap.
Completely. They unconsciously assumed that because the aesthetic and the artistic history were shared, the underlying psychology must be shared as well.
The best way I can wrap my head around this is through a tech analogy. Imagine you need a new laptop for work. You go down to the electronics store and you intentionally buy a machine that looks exactly like your old one.
Okay, I follow.
The sleek aluminum chassis is identical, the screen resolution is the same, the keyboard layout has every key right where your fingers expect it to be.
So you feel right at home.
Exactly. You bring it home feeling totally confident, you hit the power button, the screen lights up beautifully, and you go to open your files. But the moment you try to do anything, chaos ensues.
Right, nothing works the way it should.
You swipe left on the trackpad, and the cursor shoots right. The file directories are structured in a completely alien hierarchy that makes no logical sense to you. The keyboard shortcuts you've used for a decade suddenly delete your work instead of saving it.
That sounds like a nightmare.
It is. The machine looks identical on the outside, but you realize with a sinking feeling in your stomach that it is running a fundamentally different operating system.
And that is precisely what happened on a macroeconomic scale. The hardware, the physical appearance, the religion, the grand architecture, the high art, that was all completely compatible.
But the psychological operating system, the invisible internal code that dictates how a society processes concepts, like individual ambition, the concept of wealth, the role of community, and the nature of authority.
That code was written using a completely different language.
Think about the last time you traveled abroad to a place you thought you understood. You step off the plane, and everything looks reassuringly familiar. People are wearing jeans, there's a familiar coffee chain on the corner, they drive on the same side of the road.
So you walk in feeling completely confident.
Right. But the second you try to actually navigate the unwritten social rules, maybe how to tip or how to politely disagree or how people view personal space, you completely freeze up.
The culture shock hits you sideways because it's invisible.
That is the exact disorientation those executives felt in 1992, but playing out with billions of dollars on the line.
To figure out exactly where that operating system changed, we really have to spool the timeline way back. Because there was a moment in history when the East and the West were actually running on the exact same code.
Wait, really? The exact same?
Essentially, yes. To find the source of the divergence, we have to travel back 1,000 years, to roughly the year 1000.
It is wild to think about. 1,000 years ago, the tracks were perfectly aligned. We are looking at the era of the Kievan Rus, specifically the golden age of a ruler named Rurik, and what we could basically call the tragedy of the missing Renaissance.
Let's set the stage in the medieval world. Around the year 1000, we see the emergence of Novgorod, which is a major settlement situated about 140 kilometers south of where St. Petersburg stands today.
Okay, so up north.
Yes. And the key figure here is Prince Rurik. What is crucial about Rurik is that his gaze is firmly fixed on the West.
He isn't trying to build an isolated, inward-looking kingdom. He wants to be a European player.
Exactly. He is looking at his peers and cousins in Western Europe who are beginning to lay the foundations of the Hanseatic League.
And just to clarify how important that is, the Hanseatic League wasn't just a couple of merchants trading apples. It became a massive, incredibly dominant commercial and defensive network of merchant guilds and market towns that stretched across northwestern and central Europe.
It was practically a medieval precursor to the European Union.
Yes, built entirely on the flow of capital goods and shared legal protections.
And Rurik sees the immense prosperity generated by these early Hanseatic trade hubs. Haar specifically mentions him looking toward Dutch cities like Zutphen and Deventer, alongside major ports like Hamburg and Kiel. And Rurik decides to explicitly model Novgorod on them.
He doesn't just want to trade with them, he wants to replicate their success.
Right. He builds heavy fortress walls around Novgorod, structurally mirroring cities like Zutphen. He constructs massive, bustling trade quays right in the center of the city to handle enormous volumes of cargo.
You can just imagine the scene at those quays. It would have been a chaotic, thriving, multicultural hub. You'd have ships coming in from the Baltic Sea, the smell of massive quantities of beeswax and timber, merchants shouting over each other, trading European silver for Russian grain and furs.
Novgorod becomes a booming economic engine, deeply integrated into the European trade network.
And Rurik takes it a step further to ensure cultural alignment. He and his descendants adopt Christianity, specifically to legitimize their standing with the great European powers.
That's a huge move.
Right. From Novgorod, this dynasty expands aggressively southward, eventually establishing a grand, shimmering capital in Kiev. This creates the massive realm known as Kievan Rus.
So at this point in history, the East and the West are moving in lockstep. The trade is fluid, the cultural exchange is constant, the religious baseline is shared.
If you were a merchant traveling from a Hanseatic city to Kiev in the 12th century, you'd feel like you were simply in a different province of the same broad civilization.
Until the catastrophe hits.
Right. We move forward to roughly 1250. And this is where the timeline brutally and violently fractures. Enter the Mongol horde.
Specifically, we're talking about the armies led by Batu Khan, who was the grandson of Genghis Khan. They sweep out of the steppes with a military machine that no one in Europe can comprehend, let alone stop.
They invade Kievan Rus, and what follows isn't just a typical medieval territorial dispute or a temporary change in management. The Mongols throw up a massive, impenetrable wall.
They completely sever Kievan Rus from the rest of Europe, dragging it into a vastly different empire.
And this total isolation doesn't last for a decade or two. It lasts for 300 years.
3 entire centuries. It is genuinely hard to wrap your head around that scale of time.
In our modern context, 300 years ago was the early 1700s. Think about the technological and social leap from the Salem witch trials to artificial intelligence and smartphones.
That is how much time passed while Russia was trapped behind this wall.
And because of that wall, you have two massive populations on either side evolving in completely different directions.
Tracing the mechanics of those diverging paths is the key to everything. Let's look at the West first. While Russia is locked down under Mongol occupation, what is happening in Europe?
A lot.
Right. Those 300 years just happen to be the most radically transformative centuries in European history. Europe goes through a series of massive intellectual and social revolutions that bypass Russia entirely.
The source outlines a few of these, starting with scholasticism.
Yes, scholasticism in the Middle Ages. This was the rigorous philosophical movement in Europe that sought to reconcile Christian theology with classical philosophy, particularly Aristotle.
It seems abstract, but the mechanism is vital. It introduced deep, systematic critical thinking and debate into European universities. It taught the West how to argue logically and question assumptions.
And that intellectual foundation leads directly into the Renaissance and humanism. This is where Haar brings up Erasmus, the great Dutch philosopher.
Why is Erasmus such a linchpin in this story?
Because he was a massive, vocal advocate for the education of the masses and the development of middle class. Before this, Europe was largely just a tiny ruling elite and a massive peasantry.
Erasmus pushed the radical idea that a society needs an educated, empowered middle layer. This is the seed of civic duty, social mobility, and the idea that you can improve your station in life through your own effort.
Building on that empowerment, you have the philosophical revolution, perfectly encapsulated by René Descartes. This is a monumental shift. Descartes gives us the famous Latin maxim, cogito ergo sum.
I think, therefore I am.
Exactly.
But how does that actually change the way a society functions on a daily basis?
It fundamentally rewrites the individual's place in the universe. Prior to this, the center of existence was the divine or the absolute monarch. You were just a small, insignificant piece of a grand, divinely ordained puzzle.
But Descartes shifts the center of reality right down into the individual human mind.
Yes. It tells the European citizen, you possess rationality. You possess reason. Therefore, you are an independent agent. You have the power and the right to take your fate into your own hands. You aren't just a subject, you are an individual.
You are the driver of your own life. And then, as the final pillar of this Western evolution, you have Martin Luther and the Reformation. Luther essentially teaches the West how to protest against absolute, unchecked authority.
Right, he challenges the absolute monopoly of the Catholic Church.
And argues for a direct, unmediated personal relationship with God. So over the course of those 300 years, while the wall is up, Europe gets Erasmus, Descartes, and Luther.
We develop a robust middle class, we birth the concept of the sovereign individual, and we institutionalize the spirit of protest and self-determination.
Now, pivot to the East. Russia experienced absolutely none of this. They had no Renaissance, they had no Reformation, they had no philosophical enlightenment celebrating the power of the individual.
Well, none of it. Instead, they spent 300 years surviving under the brutal, highly extractive authoritarianism of the Mongol Khans.
And we have to look closely at the mechanism of that survival. How exactly do you survive 3 centuries of a foreign occupation that demands massive tributes?
Well, you certainly don't survive by standing up, declaring, I think, therefore I am, and attempting to take your fate into your own hands.
Oh, absolutely not. If you try to exert rugged individualism against the Mongol horde, you and your entire family are immediately crushed.
Exactly. Individualism is literally a lethal liability in that environment. The Mongol tribute system was largely collective. If a village was ordered to provide a certain amount of grain, silver, or conscripts, the quota fell on the village as a whole, not on individuals.
So if your neighbor couldn't pay his share, the Mongol tax collectors didn't just punish your neighbor, they punished the whole village.
Right. Therefore, you survive by doing the exact opposite of what the West was doing. You develop a culture of deep, intense, mandatory reliance on your immediate community. You pool your resources. You cover for each other.
This brings us to a really crucial Russian cultural concept, sobornost.
Sobornost is a profound, almost spiritual sense of togetherness and communal unity. It is the deep-seated acceptance that your individual fate is largely out of your control.
Your life is dictated by forces far larger, far more powerful, and far more terrifying than you, whether that's the Mongol Khan, a future czar, or simply the brutal Russian winter.
Right, you cannot control the weather and you cannot control the Khan.
Right.
Therefore, your only safety net is your neighbor, your family, your community. The individual ego must be entirely subjugated to the survival of the group.
I think we need to pause here and challenge how we in the West typically view this. Because we are so steeped in Descartes, we almost universally view individualism as an absolute, unquestionable moral good.
Oh, for sure.
But there's a massive double-edged sword at play. Yes, the West got every man for himself, which acts as rocket fuel for capitalism, innovation, and personal wealth. But it also breeds deep social isolation, a breakdown of family units, and a very transactional view of human relationships.
That's a really good point.
Russia, by missing out on the Renaissance and enduring the Mongols, developed an incredible, almost unbreakable communal resilience that the West lacks. Haar shares a very personal example of this that really illustrates the difference.
The reaction to Western nursing homes.
Yes, this blew my mind. She mentions talking to her Russian friends and explaining the Western concept of elderly care, that when our parents get too old or frail to care for themselves, we often move them into institutional nursing homes.
And her Russian friends were absolutely fundamentally horrified by this.
Right. In Russia, driven by this centuries-old concept of sobornost, the unwritten cultural mandate is that you never, under any circumstances, abandon your elders to an institution. You care for them at home within the family unit.
And Terhar notes that this isn't simply a matter of the Russian state lacking the funds for luxury care facilities. It is a deeply ingrained psychological and moral imperative.
The community absorbs the burden, no matter how difficult it is. You suffer together, you endure together, you celebrate together.
The comfort of the individual is always secondary to the cohesion of the whole.
So you have these two completely different operating systems baking in the oven for 300 years. What happens when the timer goes off? Because the Mongol occupation eventually ends.
Right. Around 1550, the wall comes down. The independent Tsardom of Russia emerges, and the Russian rulers look across their western border to see what Europe has been up to.
And they realize with absolute horror that they are centuries behind. Europe has printing presses, advanced maritime navigation, complex banking systems, a flourishing mercantile middle class, and modern standing armies.
Meanwhile, Russia has a deeply traumatized, largely agrarian society that has been optimized for nothing but survival and tribute payments.
So what is the logical next step for the Russian elite?
You panic, and you try to copy-paste Europe onto Russia as quickly and forcefully as humanly possible.
Precisely. This kicks off the era of the Romanov catch-up, a massive top-down modernization project stretching from roughly 1550 all the way to the absolute explosion of the 1917 revolution.
And the absolute poster child for this desperate copy-paste effort is Peter the Great. We are jumping into the late 17th and early 18th centuries now.
Peter is a fascinating figure. He is literally obsessed with Western Europe, and he is particularly infatuated with the Netherlands.
He decides he needs to see European innovation for himself, so he goes on this massive diplomatic and educational tour called the Grand Embassy.
And he tries to travel incognito, pretending to be a common shipbuilder, which is completely absurd because he was something like 6'8" and traveled with a massive entourage.
Not very subtle.
Not at all. Haar details just how deeply Peter immersed himself in Dutch science and engineering. He doesn't just attend royal banquets. He seeks out the great minds.
He visits Herman Boerhaave, the legendary botanist and humanist, to understand European medicine and science. He spends time with Antony van Leeuwenhoek, the father of microbiology, spending hours peering through his newly invented microscopes, marveling at this invisible world.
He meets with William III. He extensively studies the Beemsterpolder, obsessed with the engineering of how the Dutch managed to drain massive lakes and reclaim arable land from the water.
He is basically acting as an absolute sponge, soaking up every drop of European technology, science, and aesthetics.
And he is so thoroughly impressed by the Dutch that he says, I'm taking this home. He literally recruits an estimated 60,000 Dutch craftsmen, engineers, and shipbuilders and brings them to Russia.
Wow.
Right. He uses them to build his new, aggressively European-facing capital, St. Petersburg, draining the freezing mosquito-infested swamps to build a city of canals that looks like Amsterdam on steroids.
And this trend continues after him. Catherine the Great does something very similar, extending huge tax breaks and land grants to bring in massive numbers of German farmers and engineers to modernize Russian agriculture and industry.
They are desperately importing the aesthetic, the architecture, and the hard technology of the West.
But if we go back to your laptop analogy, they're merely importing the shiny new European user interface. They are completely maintaining the old, top-down, authoritarian Mongol operating system underneath.
And this is the fatal structural flaw of the Tsarist era.
Right. They wanted the ships and the science, but they did not want the philosophy. They emphatically did not import Erasmus's empowered middle class.
They certainly did not import Descartes' individual rights or Luther's spirit of protest.
They wanted modern European output, but they maintained a societal structure that was dangerously, laughably top-heavy.
The demographic reality of this era is genuinely staggering. You have a society where roughly 3% of the population makes up the absolute elite, the czar, the high nobility, the aristocrats.
And they live in unimaginable fairy tale luxury in St. Petersburg. They speak French to each other because Russian is considered too peasant-like. They wear the latest Parisian fashions.
And beneath them, you have 90% of the entire population living as serfs. And we need to be very clear about the mechanism of serfdom.
These were not simply poor farmers or low-wage employees.
No, they were essentially state properties. They were human beings legally tied to the land, bought, sold, and owned by that top 3%.
The sheer scale of this inequality breaks the brain. Haar mentions one specific nobleman, a man named Sheremetev.
Now, if you have ever flown into Moscow on a business trip or vacation, you have likely flown into Sheremetevo International Airport, which is named after his family's historic estate.
In the 18th century, this one single man, this one aristocrat, owned 1.2 million serfs.
Let that sit for a second. 1.2 million human beings. He owned more people than the population of many European cities at the time.
Try to imagine the daily economic and psychological reality of a society structured that way. How does the local economy even function when almost everyone in it owns nothing?
This is exactly why it matters so much for our confused Campina executive standing in that Moscow conference room in 1992.
Wait, let's really connect the dots here, because this is the light bulb moment. Let's compare a Dutch farmer in the 18th century to a Russian serf on Sheremetev's estate.
In Europe, thanks to Erasmus's philosophies and the rise of mercantilism, a robust middle class has evolved. What does a middle-class farmer or tradesman learn to do?
They learn to be incredibly frugal with their capital. They learn to meticulously care for their tools because they own them. They learn to take entrepreneurial initiative and innovate.
Why? Because the mechanism of the society allows them to keep the profits of their labor. If that Dutch farmer works late into the night, saves his money, and invents a slightly more efficient plow, his crop yield goes up, he sells more grain, and his family eats better.
The system rewards his individual initiative.
But in Russia, for nearly 400 years under the Tsars, 90% of the population literally owned nothing. They did not own the land, they did not own the plow, they did not even own their own bodies.
So ask yourself, why on earth would a serf ever take initiative? Why would they try to innovate? Why would they care in the slightest about the profit margin of the nobleman's estate?
If a serf works twice as hard and doubles the crop yield, the serf's life doesn't improve one bit. The nobleman in St. Petersburg simply uses the extra profit to import a larger chandelier from France or buy another thoroughbred horse.
The serf gets absolutely nothing.
Over generations, that creates a profound, deeply ingrained, learned economic helplessness. You learn in your very bones that economic initiative is pointless, even dangerous.
You learn that survival means keeping your head down, doing exactly what authority tells you to do, relying entirely on your fellow serfs, falling back on that communal sobornist, and accepting your fate.
Eventually, even the Russian elite realized that this system is entirely unsustainable. It is a massive powder keg. By the 19th century, you have a wave of well-meaning nobles, intellectuals, and artists, giants like Tchaikovsky, Dostoevsky, and Ivan Turgenev, who are desperately pleading for systemic reform.
If you read Turgenev's masterpiece, Fathers and Sons, it captures this agonizing generational tension and the realization that Serfdom is both a moral abomination and an absolute economic disaster that is holding Russia back from the modern world.
And all of this pressure leads to a monumental historical pivot in 1861 under Tsar Alexander II. He makes the massive decision to finally abolish serfdom, emancipate the masses.
But here is the tragedy, and Turnar emphasizes this heavily. It was a catastrophic failure of execution because it was done without a plan B.
How so? How do you mess up freeing the slaves?
Because it was an overnight bureaucratic dismantling of the entire social and economic structure of the empire. Yes, legally, on paper, the serfs were suddenly free citizens, but they were freed with absolutely zero capital.
They couldn't afford to buy the land they and their ancestors had worked for centuries.
The state offered complex, deeply unfair loans that just trapped them in debt. There was no robust legal framework to protect their new status, and most importantly, they had absolutely zero education or institutional knowledge of how to operate as independent actors in a free market system.
It was an unmitigated disaster. The nobility were furious because they lost their massive pool of free labor overnight, and the millions of freed serfs were furious because they were suddenly thrust into crushing, completely unprotected poverty in a proto-capitalist system they didn't understand and couldn't participate in.
They went from being cared for as property, which is horrific, to starving as free men.
The structural rod of the Peter the Great model finally gave way. The 1861 abolition of serfdom didn't diffuse the powder keg. It practically lit the fuse for the absolute burning rage that would eventually culminate in the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution.
Which brings us directly to the third massive historical shift. The failure to integrate those millions of serfs, the failure to build that crucial middle class that Erasmus envisioned, led to the total, violent collapse of the Tsarist system in 1917.
But instead of replacing the absolute authority of the Tsar with a decentralized Western-style democracy, Russia simply swapped one form of absolute authority for another.
They moved from the divine right of the Tsar to the absolute dictate of the Soviet state.
The communist paradox. This is where the story gets incredibly nuanced and, frankly, very uncomfortable for a lot of Westerners to process.
Oh, absolutely.
Because in the West, the Soviet era is almost universally painted with a single, very dark brush. It is viewed purely as an evil empire. And we must absolutely acknowledge the horrific, undeniable baseline of trauma.
Haar notes that virtually every single family in Russia lost someone to Stalin's purges, the gulags, and the sheer terror of those early Soviet decades. That trauma is baked into the national psyche.
But to understand our 1990s corporate executives, we have to look past Stalin. We have to look at the post-war reality of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s under leaders like Leonid Brezhnev and Yuri Andropov.
Because this is the specific era that formed the worldview of the workforce that Heineken and Campina hired.
Exactly. This post-war era represents a completely different social contract than what was happening simultaneously in the West. Let's do a direct contrast of how everyday life functioned.
Think about the Western post-war boom, the golden age of the American dream, or the Western European economic miracle. The entire social engine was driven by materialism, individual ambition, and social mobility.
Haar uses a great automotive analogy to explain this. In the West, parents spent their careers striving to upgrade. You start out driving a basic, cheap DAF, a tiny little Dutch commuter car, and you work hard, you climb the ladder so that eventually you can show off your success by driving a luxury Mercedes.
It was entirely about displaying status, out-earning your neighbor, taking your individual fate into your hands, and aggressively climbing the socioeconomic ladder.
But in the USSR, during those same decades, the social contract was fundamentally radically different. The new absolute top-down authority stepped in and provided everything, and I mean everything.
Haar lists the reality of everyday Soviet life. Free water, free gas, free electricity, free university education, free healthcare.
The basic anxieties of survival, the terror of going bankrupt from a medical bill or freezing to death because you couldn't pay the heating bill, were completely eliminated by the state.
But the trade-off for that absolute security was a hard, immovable ceiling on materialism and individual ambition. There was no upgrading from a DAF to a Mercedes.
Right. No matter how smart you were or how hard you worked, everyone drove the exact same boxy Lada.
It was a society that theoretically eliminated class anxiety by completely eliminating class mobility. And to a Westerner raised on Descartes and capitalism, that sounds incredibly stifling, even dystopian.
But you have to view it through the lens of Russian history. For a population whose grandfathers were literal serfs owned by aristocrats and whose fathers survived the meat grinder of World War II and Stalin's terror, this boring gray stability was a profound, unprecedented luxury.
The ultimate symbol of success in this era wasn't a sports car or a Rolex. It was simply getting a new apartment. The famous Plattenbau concrete housing blocks that you still see dominating the skylines across Eastern Europe.
Exactly. We look at those concrete blocks today and think they look depressing. But before those were built, millions of Soviet citizens were living in incredibly cramped communal housing, sharing a single kitchen and bathroom with 4 other families.
Getting your own private Plattenbau apartment with your own private toilet and your own private shower was a massive, life-altering leap in quality of life.
And the ultimate luxury, the absolute peak of Soviet middle-class existence, wasn't a trip to the Riviera, it was the right to a dacha.
The dacha, the country house. This is a vital piece of the cultural puzzle if you want to understand the modern Russian mindset.
Terhar paints such a vivid, almost romantic picture of the dacha life, because everyday Soviet citizens couldn't just book a flight to Paris or London for a summer vacation. They turned inward.
Weekends and summers were spent out at the dacha, usually just a modest wooden cabin with a garden plot outside the city.
And the culture around it wasn't about conspicuous consumption. It was about connecting with nature and tapping right back into that deep, centuries-old communal subornust.
She describes weekends spent walking through the ancient birch forests, picking mushrooms, fishing with neighbors in the mighty Yenisei River, or, for the truly adventurous, traveling out east to climb volcanoes in Kamchatka.
It was a life deeply rooted in the land, in shared experience, in sitting around a table drinking vodka and talking about philosophy. It was a society completely, intentionally insulated from the exhausting anxieties of the capitalist rat race.
And while that insulation fostered a rich internal life, it created a profound, blinding political and economic blind spot. This is where Terhar shares a very revealing, almost funny personal anecdote from her time studying in the USSR in 1983.
I loved this story because it perfectly captures Western arrogance. So it's 1983, the absolute height of the Cold War. Terhaikar is a young, idealistic student visiting the USSR, completely filled with Western democratic ideals.
She is sitting with her Russian friend, whom she calls Ivan, and she starts pushing him, pressing him with all the well-meaning arrogance of a Westerner who thinks they know better.
She says to him, Ivan, don't you want freedom? Don't you want democracy? Don't you want a multi-party political system where you have a voice? Like we have back in the Netherlands with the Christian Democrats, the Labour Party, the Green Party.
And Ivan's reaction is incredibly telling of the psychological divide.
He doesn't argue with her. He doesn't defend communism. He just stares at her with wide eyes. He has absolutely no idea what she is talking about.
The very concept of political pluralism simply wasn't part of his vocabulary. The idea of choosing a political party to optimize your personal economic status was as alien to him as speaking Martian.
To Ivan, and millions like him, the state was just a given reality. It was like the weather. You don't hold a vote on whether it should rain, you just put on a coat and deal with it.
As long as the state provided the concrete apartment, the lada, the dacha, and the security of the community, the idea of engaging in political agitation or individual economic striving was completely meaningless.
This brings us to the ultimate Soviet paradox, the very thing that our Campina executive in the 1990s completely failed to grasp. The Soviet system absolutely ruthlessly suppressed political freedom and crushed individual economic initiative.
But simultaneously, and this is the paradox, it massively elevated education, high culture, and gender equality in ways that the West was actually lagging behind on at the time.
Yes. Terhar emphasizes this point very strongly because it shatters our stereotypes. The Soviet state needed to rapidly industrialize to compete with the West, so they forcefully educated everyone.
Women were massively integrated into the highest levels of the workforce. While a woman in the West in the 1960s might have been culturally pressured to stay home and manage the household, women in the Soviet Union were nuclear scientists, university professors, chief engineers, and yes, tractor drivers on the massive collective farms.
The state demanded total participation.
And high culture thrived within these specific state-sanctioned boundaries. You had a society producing brilliant grandmasters in chess like Garry Kasparov.
You had world-class orchestras performing complex works by Shostakovich and Rimsky-Korsakov to pack houses of factory workers. You had a general population that was incredibly well-read, highly educated in the hard sciences, and culturally sophisticated.
And this is the massive, flashing neon bayou that changes everything. They were a highly educated society entirely devoid of commercial or economic self-reliance.
You had a workforce that could split the atom, they could compose a breathtaking symphony, they could beat you in 12 moves in a chess match. But they had never once in their entire lives had to think about a profit margin, a marketing budget, consumer demand, or a quarterly earnings report.
Why would they? The state did all the math for them. The state dictated the prices. The state allocated the resources.
The state decided how many shoes would be made next year, regardless of whether anyone wanted to buy them.
The citizens were shielded from the mechanics of money. Until, of course, the state finally ran out of it.
Which brings us to the final act, the collapse and the echoes of history. Because a highly educated, community-focused society where everyone gets free gas, free water, and a free dacha sounds like a socialist utopia on paper.
But eventually, reality comes knocking. You have to ask the inevitable pragmatic question, who is actually paying for all that free gas in Siberia?
The math simply didn't work. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev takes power in the mid-1980s, he looks at the ledger and realizes something terrifying. The bank is totally empty.
The Soviet state is functionally bankrupt. It cannot afford to maintain the massive, crumbling infrastructure. It cannot pay the pensions across 11 time zones. It cannot subsidize the free utilities. And it certainly cannot keep up the ruinously expensive arms race with the United States.
The entire system buckles under the weight of its own inefficiency.
And when it finally collapses in 1991, it doesn't just slowly fade away. It shatters into a million pieces overnight. The West rushes in, cheering for the fall of communism, and immediately prescribes an economic policy that became known as shock therapy.
Immediate privatization, immediate transition to a free market.
And this is where Haar draws a direct, haunting, historical parallel that ties this entire thousand-year story together. She draws a straight, undeniable line between the shock therapy of the 1990s under Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin and the 1861 abolition of serfdom under the Tsar.
It is the exact same catastrophic mistake, repeated 130 years later.
Precisely. In both historical moments, an all-encompassing absolute system that had dictated every single aspect of human life, housing, food, labor, security, was dismantled virtually overnight, with absolutely zero plan B.
Just like the serfs in 1861, the Soviet citizens in 1991 were suddenly told, congratulations, you are free. But free to do what?
This state no longer guaranteed your factory job. They no longer paid for your apartment, and your pension was suddenly worthless. And there was absolutely no institutional knowledge of how a free market actually functioned.
You had this surreal, heartbreaking tragedy playing out on the streets. You had world-class nuclear physicists, celebrated opera singers, and tenured university professors who suddenly found themselves entirely destitute.
They were literally standing on the freezing streets of Moscow in the winter of 1992, selling their own shoes or a handful of potatoes or their family heirlooms just to buy a loaf of bread, because their state-backed salaries were now worthless paper in a hyperinflated economy.
And this is the exact, precise moment that our Western executives from Heineken and Campina confidently strode into the room.
They walked into a society that had just suffered a catastrophic economic and psychological earthquake. They expected to find an eager, ambitious workforce ready to enthusiastically embrace the American dream and corporate synergy.
Because they were blinded by the hardware. They saw people who looked exactly like them, who wore suits, who knew who Tchaikovsky was, who held PhDs in engineering. They saw the familiar aesthetic and thought, these are our people.
But they were dealing with an operating system coded by 300 years of brutal Mongol occupation that enforced communal survival over individual ego, followed by 400 years of czarist serfdom, where personal economic initiative was literally punished.
Followed by 70 years of a Soviet nanny state that provided every necessity of life but permitted absolutely no individual economic agency.
It is no wonder the Russian employees stared blankly when asked about corporate democracy or profit margins. They were a deeply traumatized, highly educated population that had never, not once in 1,000 years, been taught the mechanics or the morality of a free market.
It is a profound, tragic mismatch of expectations. And Haar explains how this botched shock therapy of the 90s, this sudden, violent thrust into a predatory, unregulated capitalism where a handful of ruthless oligarchs stole the nation's vast natural resources, while the rest of the country literally starved, led directly to the chaotic, humiliating years of the Yeltsin administration.
It left a deep, agonizing generational scar. It created a profound and lasting skepticism of Western-style democracy and capitalism.
Because from the Russian perspective, when the West finally brought its operating system to Moscow, it didn't bring prosperity, freedom, or dignity. It brought absolute humiliating ruin.
Understanding this deep historical context forces us to look in the mirror. When we in the West judge other cultures for their political choices or their economic structures, we almost always operate under the unexamined assumption that our Western values, our specific brand of individualism, our democratic structures, are the default setting of humanity.
We assume everyone wants what we have, and if they don't have it, it's just because they haven't figured it out yet.
Exactly.
Let's bring this all together, because the sheer scale of this thousand-year through line is just incredible. We started in the year 1000 with the Ensiatic Promise of Rurik, a society in perfect step with European trade and culture.
We saw that connection violently severed by the Mongol horde, which birthed the deep communal survival mechanism of Sobernost.
We watched that survival mechanism morph into the massive, crushing inequality of the czars, completely freezing out the development of a middle class.
We saw that top-heavy structure preserved in amber by the Soviet nanny state, which provided everything but agency.
And finally, we saw it shattered by the disastrous shock therapy of the 1990s. It perfectly, elegantly answers the puzzle of that corporate executive from our intro. They weren't dealing with a lazy or apathetic workforce. They were dealing with 1,000 years of divergent evolution.
It is a powerful reminder that history isn't just a dry list of dates, wars, and kings. It is the slow, invisible coding of a culture's collective mind. It dictates how we see ourselves, how we relate to our neighbors, and how we view the future.
Which leaves us with one final provocative thought. If the Russian worldview, this deep sense of collectivism, the acceptance of fate, the reliance on a strong central authority, was forged by the intense trauma of a 300-year occupation and centuries of state-run survival, well, it really makes you wonder about us.
Think about the values we hold most dear. Our most deeply held Western beliefs about rugged individualism, free will, and taking fate into our own hands, really the universal human truths we think they are.
Or are they just the psychological luxury of a culture that happened to get lucky enough to avoid a Mongol invasion?